That's right. Get that caffeine and we have it. So it's 9:01. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. And I know that people will be joining, but we can go ahead and start. So I am super, super thrilled to have these three esteemed professionals here. I'm not going to do a formal introduction until we get to each one of the sections, but I do want to say hello to Dr. Catherine McCarthy, Dr. Jonathan Dalton, and Dr. Maria Zimmitti. And it was just such a pleasure to work with each of you on the road to getting here today. And I know that everybody here is in for a really big treat. And so I wanted to just start by sharing, I am Debbie Rosen. For those of you who don't know me, I am the founder and co-owner of the Study Pro, along with Lindsay Toms, who is also on backup here today, and going to help monitor the questions. But I wanted to give a little overview of how today would go. So we're going to start with Dr. Kathy McCarthy, who's going to talk a little bit about the state of the state. And I think we all know that the pandemic has had some good and some bad, some silver linings and some other things, but it also has had quite an impact on the mental health for many of us and many around us. And so we'll talk about that and what are some of the things that we can do as parents, followed by Dr. Dalton, who has spoken here before and shared so many great insights for parents into how we can help reduce our students' anxiety, our own children's anxiety. And a lot of it is by modeling, and a lot of it is by things that seem maybe counterintuitive, but are really incredibly effective. And so whether your child is really suffering from anxiety or just is having anxiety for this pace of the life that we have here in 2021, I think you're going to find this incredibly useful. And then Dr. Zimmitti is going to talk a little bit about how we can fill our own buckets and why it's so important as parents for us to do all of that, because for us to really show up as parents, we have to have enough energy and enough fulfillment and feel whole so that we can be there for everybody else. So to start, again, I want to say good morning to everybody and just do a quick introduction of who the Study Pro is. One of the goals that we've had since starting this organization 6+ years ago is that we really want to share this type of information and educate the world on executive function. Why does executive function even matter? Executive function is a set of mental processes that help us make goals and then reach those goals, but also have kind of the emotional abilities and control to be able to do that. And when it comes to school, these are really recognized in the set of skills that you see here on the right. And oftentimes we hear at the Study Pro that students are not really meeting their potential, but they're very smart. And we often try to educate that there's the content side of school, which is the math, science, and history, that you think of as almost verticals, and they rest on a platform, which is really that executive function. And as school gets increasingly difficult, just like, skiing, you can start in elementary school on the green hill, but then as you move to middle school, you're getting to your blue hill and you're then moving on to your black hill in high school and college. And what that means is that you need more and more tools to manage. It's still skiing, it's still math, science, and history, but you need more and more tools to manage those things as it gets steeper. And that's really those executive function skills. And so we really want parents to look at that as two separate things, that the IQ really doesn't have anything to do with how well those skills are developed, because executive functioning is really developmental. So as we get older and move into middle and high school, our executive function skills will develop, but it's also something that we may have to teach explicitly, which is really what we do. And we really try to help students understand that when there are barriers to reaching any of these skills or to having these skills, that there are strategies, and that we just apply those strategies, and that those are things that can be practiced and learned and improved. And learning is a skill. And so that's really what we do. And more to my point earlier of what we really thrive or excited about doing, and I'm proud of is the fact that we can bring a lot of these professionals to you. And we have a few things coming up. We will send the slides out later and you can get this recording, but just so you know, in November, we brought back our free and in-person growth mindset workshops for 4th and 5th graders, which we just held one and we're very excited about that. Sorry, it doesn't note that they're 4th and 5th grade for these workshops, but you can find information on our website. And then next month we have Dr. Bonnie Zucker, who this panel knows is really phenomenal. And she's going to be talking about CBT tips and tricks for anxiety. And then we have a book talk in December with Dr. Bill Stixrud and Ned Johnson on their first book, What Do You Say? How to Talk with Kids to Build Motivation, Stress Tolerance, and a Happy Home. So we're really hoping that you can join us for that, and we'll send invitations out to each one of you if you're a part of this. So with that as an introduction, I would like to then move to introducing Dr. McCarthy, who, for those of you who know my introductions, they tend to be a little bit more personal than, rote. So I wanted to share that Dr. McCarthy has been part of my family's life for as long as I can remember. And the number of people that she, and of course, everyone on this panel has really touched and influenced, she, to me, is a star here in McLean, Virginia, and way beyond. I know that many of you here are so grateful for everything that she's done, but her tenacity into digging into the data and staying current on everything that matters and making sure that she doesn't give up until she finds what her patients, which in my case were my 2 children, need to feel successful and help them understand why it's so important, is just been life-changing, I know, for not only me, but so many of us. And so I'm really honored to have had her speak at our grand opening and many other times here, and have her here with us this morning. And so, Dr. McCarthy, I'm going to turn it over to you and mute myself. So welcome.
Well, that's too kind. I'm utterly humbled. And, first and foremost, it's, I wish I could see your faces. It's always daunting to look at this little green light, but I'm just so honored to be here. And I know all of you as parents have been through so much that you would, if you think back 5 years ago, 10 years ago, earlier in life, you would not have thought possible. And here you are. And so I hope you continue to pat yourself on the back. And I know Dr. Zimmitti will talk about self and compassion in a beautiful way, but recognizing, can you believe where you are? And certainly in the mental health field, goodness gracious, I'm not intubating people like some of my friends in hospitals right now that still are taking care of patients with COVID. But in mental health, it's not been for the faint of heart. And I think all of us in the field would feel, might think of it like a hamster wheel or whack-a-mole, just where you get one thing, take care of, then the new thing, and it changes all the time. And although in the beginning, when I gave, lectures a year and a half ago, as it started, had great plans, personally, of Marie Kondoing my closet, which I still have yet to go into, or had some wild idea with learn Spanish or go fully electronic. And if you can't see the floor in my office, along with the coffee that I spilled, it's just covered because I suddenly recognized you'd be able to see my desk. We've all been doing the best we can, and some of us better than others. But for kids, even though we kept on thinking, oh gosh, it'll be summer, they won't have math this year, everything will be better, it continues to get, in many respects, yes, better with kids in school, but also get harder. And now we are starting to see the effects of what is happening in mental health to kids in real time. And just like we learned about COVID in real time, we're learning now about the longer term impact of what all this has done to vulnerable kids on their brains and development, but now trying to be ahead of things before there's a tsunami, ahead of the wave, to be able to see what we can do, since most experts say something along the lines of the fallout of the pandemic will lie squarely in the land of mental health, and could really affect generations to come, both for good and also for vulnerable populations in ways that are frankly scarier. So we now know, certainly in our own lives, the exterior stuff that's changed, but certainly interior in our brains, some stuff that has changed. So with looking at where we are now and what we saw a year ago, when I started to lecture about this, is, for vulnerable populations, which include children because their brains are still growing up, and for people that already had anxiety, certainly the impact of COVID from a couple fold, that we all know so well. It's wild to lecture about things that are a collective experience, because in the past, when lecturing, whether to parents, teachers, students, med students, colleagues, it's been teaching, hopefully things that people wouldn't have known. And now here I am talking to you, and you've lived it, breathed it. So we truly are all in this together. So the talk about it's hit all of us collectively in different forms, but the impact of all of us of chronic trauma, chronic stress, even with the good stuff that comes from being all together and families being closer together, from having uncertainty every day with the everyday something new. And there was, all of us know times where it felt like every day a situation was changing. And we still have that, part of our brain, the amygdala, just waiting for something to drop. Losing the routine, now getting it back to some degree, but still it's all weirdo world. And that's lack of structure, tough on that frontal lobe that, talking about with Study for Hope, but tough on all of us. And then still the fact that there's contagious anxiety that all of us, pick up on each other's stuff, and kids do too. And so all of this in the air for 18, 20 months has taken a toll. And this now, it sounds melodramatic to say this, but it's almost like it's a race for the researchers now to look at the pandemic's toll on kids' brains, just like there's a race to get a vaccine. And just like we learned about COVID in real time, we're learning about this, and the trick is to be ahead of it. And there's some really exciting research, and that's what I want to talk to you about. And I'm going to keep an eye on the time to at least, give you both the bad, but also the good. All age ranges affected in different ways, no surprise. And originally, gosh, maybe the little kids bounce back. They've got, they got play dates outside, not as much of an impact as college students, but all age range showing effect. And certainly when hearing about, last week, UNC, the week before, someone I trained with is the chair there, and seeing her on CNN, it's like, why is Smith on CNN? Oh my gosh, the populations and the fallout is so grave at times. And the White House had a big press release last week as well. So we already knew, of course, that, and about it from, being here at Study Pro, and from, really, I'm such a privilege to work around here with all parents being so well educated, like colleagues, even more so, is that the kids' brains are more vulnerable because they're still developing, more resilient because they're still developing, but more vulnerable. And we already knew that before the pandemic, mental health issues were on the rise, with anxiety and depression in teens, well before the pandemic ever happened. Even yesterday, I was in my obsessive, neurotic way, overcompensating for this lecture, looking up, okay, do I have all the recent stuff? And no, I don't. Actually, there's new stuff that just came out yesterday from Rutgers. There's a study that showed that there's a very high level of social emotional difficulties and hyperactivity in the younger kids. They have a huge new survey out. University of Oregon has a study that is for all of us here as parents, highlighting that, that guilt that we get as parents, that parent stress has indeed trickled down to and had an effect on kids' stress. And, I always got kind of, as in the teenage word, cringy when I went to conferences as a child psychiatrist or as a med student early on, about how, just sometimes things would get blamed on parents or mothers, and, there's all this guilt that parents had so much. And I really try to stay away from that, since we're all human, but certainly our parent response and the way parents cope has had an impact on kids, and manifested in research that's just coming out this week, and that behavioral problems have worsened significantly. And similar, this is no surprise in the behavioral emotional stuff. In trauma gets worse. We know that from national disasters, but with chronic trauma and with things theoretically getting better and kids back at school, it's freaky that it's not getting better. And another Massachusetts study came out last night about that. And the decades of neuroscience has showed us that, about these developing brains that kids have. And with that, still, even knowing their brains do bounce back more resilient, that kids truly have it, harder now. We all have it hard, every human. Some people have it horribly hard, but kids have it so super hard. And in thinking about them, in some respects, this again sounds a bit dramatic, but I look at it as for many kids, especially in the lockdown, is having arrested development. And for kids that were vulnerable already with social anxiety, developmental disabilities, attention deficit, web-based learning could be, regressive development. And when you see changes in behavior, it gives you a clue that things are changing in the brain. And that's how looking at the research that I'm about to talk about, what is happening in behavior, starts to tell us something about kids' brains. And we don't want to be too late in thinking about that, because it'll be too late with those windows of neuroplasticity. And with that comes some power. So before the pandemic, and then Debbie, you want to put the next slide there? Yes, great. 30% of youth had symptoms of anxiety and depression. And by April 2020, that number jumped to 56%. And still in fall of 2020 was high up there, and it's still high. And that's what's surprising the researchers now, is that it's not getting better on all fronts. It has different effects, of course, on different ages. But the probably one of the studies I'll talk about in a second, it's super cool and gives a lot of actually hope and promise, and gives you something to take home, which is not all doom and gloom. The lead researcher at NIH, a woman named Dr. Susan Tapert, said a few weeks ago in the news that that really, with this research and with what's happening now, the pandemic has the possibility of having ramifications on kids' brains that we'll be seeing for years and years and years. So that was said by an NIH researcher, not just people speculating. And during, the COVID, pandemic, certainly, and if this still exists now, and the concern is that it's not getting better, 1 in 4 adolescents experiencing clinically elevated depressive symptoms. So that's 25%. And certainly anxiety being higher, and that number probably is higher than the 1 in 5. And that really leaders in the field are seeing it as a global mental health crisis in all areas of the world. And next slide. This one. It's just, when you look at the numbers, it's almost really hard for me to read. This is something that in my practice is so astounding, in that the number of kids that I would have never seen as having high levels of acuity, never would have seen it at all, is something that makes me at a point where I, shudder to check my voicemail. I have to, and all of you patients out there, I just want you to know I am checking my voicemail every day religiously. I feel like I live here, but it's the scary stuff is still there. And especially in the younger kids, to see numbers like, compared to 2019, youth age 5 to 12 have a up to 133%, double higher risk of presenting with suicidal thoughts, and ERs is just to see that in print is just really disturbing. You can go to the next slide. Just with that, let's look at something else. Now, looking at what is protective. I mean, these are two studies. These are the ones that are the take-home ones that I think are really, really, just we gotta look at hope, man, and what we can control. Is that, this study is a Stanford study that highlights that kids who have, and it's MRI study and studies looking at executive functioning, what they call higher level connectedness, and that front part of the brain, that is the last to mature, is that kids that had higher level, as they describe, connectedness in that front part of the brain, had higher level executive function skills, were less likely to have the depressive and anxiety symptoms compared to kids that struggled with it. And I certainly see that in my practice, is the kids that had executive function challenges to begin with. It's a bit of a nada that doing web-based learning that's hard to pay attention for anybody, is just gives everybody signs of attention difficulties. But that in other areas that don't have to do with learning, that having more maturity in that front part of the brain and more executive functioning skills was protective. And so they postulate how do we encourage that, given the fact that so many kids have had this arrested development, since it, that frontal lobe does so many things, not just attention, organizing, cleaning out closets like I didn't do, but paying attention. But that's a really interesting and important fact, that brain maturity and fostering that could possibly, there's a lot of speculation, but that's a place to capitalize on doing, having, it's no surprise, to controlling things we can control, building competence. Next slide. That in the looking at more hands-on what you can do as parents, this is, when I came across this is huge. And I feel like I missed something massive. Way I deal with, again, my own anxiety is I always want to read the abstract of any journal that comes my way before I go home. I have a rule that unless I have stomach flu, I have to read it before I go home. And since, with wearing a mask all the time, I haven't had stomach flu. That sounds really gross. I can't believe I said that, but I can't see your faces, so it doesn't really matter. But the ABCD study, which is such a cute name for a study, this massive study that I didn't know about till recently, where for way before the pandemic, I knew there was lots of MRI studies going on at NIH. MRIs of kids were being studied, not just with ADD, but just globally across the country and funded by NIH. And now with being able to continue to follow these kids, they're able to see what's happened with the pandemic to kids. And this is a way of being able to capture, what is happening when problems develop. And what's surprising is that there's continued, changes even as things are getting better in the pandemic. And the focus of the research is, what can we do to intervene? What can we do with these brains developing? Next slide, please. And the big take homes when looking at not just brain changes, but they're also following surveys, what's happening with kids emotionally, because we can't just look at brain changes, or else I could do that for all my patients. Like, oh, we got this going on, we need to change this. But much more importantly, looking at what is happening in real time to kids emotionally with anxiety and depression. A couple of things stand out. They're so useful. And so, of course, common sense. So much of psychiatry is common sense. But what can we do now? What are protective factors? So what is showing to a huge response, just in different trajectories of kids who have anxiety, higher levels of anxiety, depression, behavioral concerns caused by the pandemic, exacerbated by the pandemic, versus those who don't as much, is, again, putting on the parents, is that parents' response and coping has a big effect on the well-being of our kids. So again, my little pet peeve, thing I take personally, not being superhuman myself, that we all, how can we not have our stress showing to our kids? If my kids were to be watching this, which they would never do, although they did find something on YouTube of me lecturing and made fun of me during the pandemic. That was unfortunate. I didn't know it was there. I'd rather know it's not there, but don't look for it right now, please. But anyway, but when I was lecturing, but is that parents, our own anxiety, our own regulation concerns, our own understandable depression, and what's been happening to us here, our loss, does have an impact on the kids when it comes to their outcomes. And again, we cannot be perfect. We have to be gentle with ourselves. We can't be somehow Stepford parents that way, but that is something that we can work towards controlling as best as we can, recognize we're human. Also, the kids and families who really continue to have routine, executive functioning, all give us centering, reduce anxiety, but not, in the words of, there's a wonderful counselor at Potomac, Josie Woods, who has this quote that I say all the time now, do not underestimate the power of a routine. Physical activity, this is interesting. It's in a duh. Yes, physical activity helps. But the kids that had more physical activity, so pandemic actually made them more active, being outside, walks, less time inside, actually did better. And that people who kept up that physical activity moved away from these more challenged and upsetting trajectories. It seems obvious, but that is a massive thing that we can change. Consistent sleep times, almost all humans, self included, got weird at sleep during this time. But people who really work to get their sleep schedule back and kept that up with kids, they fall out of the risk level. And lastly, and this is the really tricky one, because what were we to do? We're doing the best we can. Limiting passive screen time. Screen time having correlates with negative outcomes. Well, school was on screens. Screens were how people socialized. Screens was how parents could get their work done. Screens were how we could distract our own brains at night. But that has correlates, and now we're able to see it in real time. Next slide, and then I'll stop talking in a second so that Maria can talk. So the research is clear. That some things we can now see have bigger impact than others. There's lots of things in this study that sound really, really good, but didn't show impact. I still think they sound really, really good, so I'm not going to tell you what they are because I don't want you to not do them. So you'll have to look at the NIH study for yourself. But and I, not every, just like we were told initially, maybe we don't need masks, but guess what? We need to have masks. So, I don't think all the data is out about common sense, but these things may seem obvious, but they're things that we can actually do and capitalize on. Lastly, next slide. Looking at what, just this is how I'm setting up Dr. Zimmitti, as parents, as we look at, what kids are going through now, if we think about even just think about, and I'm not sure the age range of everybody's kids here, but whether little kids, whether college kids, high school kids, they're sitting there in school right now. They've had to go full throttle, just like when we might have, for those of you who've getting on a plane for the first time, where they're, in a mask, they're sardines around all these other people. They weren't around other people, a lot of them, if they weren't in, school, didn't have the fortune of getting to be in school last year for so long. So they didn't pick up on the middle school, kind of moving and grooving stuff. They missed out on that development. There's tons of sounds, smells. You can't read people's faces. You can't really hear as well. You don't know if you're going to be left out from something. You can't really see. And having to learn. And the parents that went to back to school nights, I think got to have a taste. And I think most people would agree that just running out to like whip off the mask and around all those people, kind of like being on a plane for a while. And they're having to learn in all this. Or the kids in college having to do school from their rooms, having to learn, to learn that way. So what they're experiencing, and then a lot of the back to school nights were not, in person. So got to sit here watching through the screen and didn't have to go home and do homework afterwards. What we're asking them to do, can we even envision doing it for ourselves for a day? A lot of the parents, we haven't been back to seeing people in person or back to the offices. Offices won't let us back. So we haven't had to re-enter, then suddenly have to study for long-term tests or take class in person with all of that stuff. Like, can you imagine taking your SAT, exam on a plane right now? Just so much to get used to. So, there's a Dr. Zimmitti and her colleagues Jennifer Weaver and Dr. Mark Saccharin have created something, given the massive fallout of the mental health and intensive outpatient, called Helix, that I won't go into, and I'm sure she won't. But I can't help the motto from it, this pause, reset, and return, is when I saw that, it gave me a bit of a, just Dalai Lama. And when we look at our kids now, when we look at ourselves, how do we, and this is, Dr. Zimmitti will talk about how to be kind to yourself. How do we take a pause, try to take the good? What really matters do we get out of this? What do we really care about? What, a year ago, what we would have done to be in this place right now? And in going back, recognize that we can't all get on the horse so fast. We can't expect these kids to be suddenly doing these conditions and do the best that they can. But I give a shout out to that program because it's going to be life-changing for so many kids that have fallen, and to that phrase that is almost like a mantra to me now. So with that, I'll stop talking and I'll give it on to Dr. Zimmitti, or maybe,
Dr. Dalton.
Or Dr. Dalton. Oh, I didn't use the order. I'm sorry.
No, you're good. You're good. I'm going to share.
Embarrassing.
No, you're
I can
perfect.
turn the screen now and take care of the coffee, but
it's a growth mindset.
Yes.
So I do want to let everybody know, thank you to Cecilia and Laura and Kimberly that have asked questions so far. We are going to have the conversations first, and then we'll open it up because we have a little while for questions. So I'm going to just pull up Dr. Dalton's slides. And a very quick introduction. Dr. Dalton, not only is he renowned again in this area for his work as the founder and director of Center of Anxiety and Behavioral Change, but I will just use one anecdote. I always say that anytime he speaks, there was always something that I want to write down because when we first had him here at the Study Pro, he said that when you have anxiety, you treat avoidance. And at that time in my life, I did not understand that. And I didn't understand the avoidance that I was experiencing with my own son. And, you know, it just opened a whole world to me. And I think a lot of the words that he used is very much how we've incorporated that into to Study Pro. And his passion is to do these types of talks and to speak. And he has spoken at well over 50 events alone just this year, and just cast such a wide net. So we really appreciate, thank you for doing this. And we'll turn this over to you now.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you so much. My goal here is to limit myself because I can talk for hours about this stuff, and I know that we have a lot of things to cover. So I'm going to try and go through a fair amount in a brief period of time. So feel free to take screenshots of different things. That's the way I take notes now, is just take screenshots when all the Zoom talks I go to. So thank you, Dr. McCarthy, for setting the stage here that we are in a national, worldwide, even mental health crisis, that the rates of anxiety and depression have doubled in a calendar year. We've never seen numbers like this before. My talk is going to be designed to, what do we do about this in 20 minutes or less? And so the very first thing I want to do is to talk from a strength-based view of anxiety. So I'm only half joking when I say that if you have a kid who's smart, creative, and compassionate, the universe will go ahead and throw anxiety in for free. It really is this package deal. And rather than being an indication of a flaw or a weakness, it's a shadow cast by these virtues. And so I believe strongly that when you have a kid who has dealt with anxiety, been treated effectively for it, they're better off for having gone through it than never having it at all, because they've learned really important things they wouldn't have otherwise learned, most importantly about themselves. They've learned how to overrule fear as a decision-making tool. They've learned how to pursue their values rather than to pursue their comfort. They've watched themselves do things they didn't think they could do. These are irreplaceable skills that I just want to celebrate, because watching kids, I love my job for many, many reasons, but the primary reason is kids get better. And so as we're talking about the state of the affairs and how much suffering there is, and we've never seen numbers like this before, I just want to frame that with the great news that treatment works, and it works now as much as it did before. Yes, there's a lot more things to be worried about. I'm working with a lot of schools, and they're talking about lots of immaturity because of the arrested development that we were hearing about before. And we know that this year is not a return to normal. It's another very, very challenging year. But in the context of that is that we can do really specific things. So for the next slide, this is one of the ones where you might want to take a screenshot of it, because I can spend a half an hour just talking about these 10 things. But if there ever was a time to build resilience, this is the time for it. And so thankfully, we can draw from a couple of decades of really solid research that we know how to cultivate resiliency. Resiliency is not an attribute, it's not a characteristic, it's a skill. And like all skills, they can be taught, they can be learned, they can be practiced, and they can be improved. So we have agency over this, and this is the important thing. So these are the 10 that we really focus on. I'm going to pick out a few of these to focus on today. The more I do this work, and I specialize in school avoidance, so half the kids who see me are not even in school when they first walk in the door, but the more I come back to this word of connectedness. We know that the perception of social support is vitamin C against depression and anxiety. That it's the most robust protective factor that we know of. And we've never had a greater need for connectiveness, nor more obstacles in the last year and a half to being connected. And so one of the primary things that any parent can do right now is to facilitate connectedness, try and get kids immersed in social situations, teams, extracurriculars, inviting kids over for play dates, doing all kinds of things that are going to give a shared experience for these kids. So I want to kind of highlight that one. We hear Dr. McCarthy talking about the importance of routine. And so I often think of the 3 C's: connectedness, creativity, and continuity. And continuity is that sense of routine. And I know Josie as well, and I've heard her say the same thing. And that's, and she's absolutely right. And the science backs that up, that it superimposes a level of predictability over our daily lives, which takes away a lot of the stress of our brain trying to figure out what to do. Now, if we think about the last 18, 20 months, we've had a dearth of connectedness. We've had the opposite of continuity. So we can understand why these rates are doubling in terms of these things. The altruism part of that, we know that it gives agency. We can borrow from natural disaster literature, and we can say that giving kids things to do that give them a sense of control over the outcome. So there's a hurricane coming, giving a kid an age-appropriate activity, like making sure you pack the dog food or doing something, gives them a sense that they are involved in this process. So writing thank you notes to first responders, those kinds of things are a really, really important part of this. But I want to go down to the second to last on the left column there, kind of steal a little bit of Dr. Zimmitti's talk, which is one of the greatest gifts that you as parents can give your kids is don't tell them what to do, show them what to do. Cope out loud, model self-care. If you are modeling self-care in an observable way, you are showing the kids how to take care of themselves now and when they're grown up. They will learn that when they're an adult, oh, this is what adults do, is they value their own well-being. And so that's one of the greatest gifts that we can give them, is that ability to watch ourselves take good care of ourselves. When I do my groups for kids, one of the things that I always do is end every group with every kid saying what their personal goals are for the next week. And those goals should be measurable and achievable in a 1-week time period. So the research shows us that having goalposts they can measure their progress towards gives kids anchor points. It helps them to understand what direction they're moving in. It doesn't even matter so much what those goals are. I have a kid who cut 10 minutes off her cross-country time this year. It's amazing. I've had kids who've learned how to do a different stretch in dance class. Great. Or how to start homework the day it's assigned. Okay, that's a great goal. Having a goal they can measure is really, really important. But I want to talk about the next 3 in a little bit more detail. So yes, for all of the reasons that we heard from Dr. McCarthy, that the kids who are vulnerable, the gap has widened. The kids who have IEPs or 504s or ADHD or ASD or any of those acronyms, they were not designed to learn with asynchronous learning, with staring at a small computer screen in a room full of distractions. And so they have watched themselves flail, to be honest, not succeed. And a 1.5 years is a long time for us. If you're a kid or a teen, that's a lifetime almost. And so they don't understand context. They have a really hard time contextualize those challenges. And they are really establishing a negative self-view, seeing themselves as incompetent in academics, as incapable of success. And I'll talk in the next slide in a few minutes about what is it that we can do to help those kids. But also optimism is a core feature of what we know to be true about resilience, and it also is a skill. And so we know that individuals who are vulnerable for anxiety respond to uncertainty the way that others respond to threat. In other words, they see uncertainty itself as a threat, which of course means that they're viewing it through a very biased lens, and they're seeing one outcome as more likely, which is the stressful, anxiety-producing outcome, or what's pessimistic. And we want to arm these kids with the knowledge that just like a kid who's in first grade who says, ooh, I know the answer, does that kid always have the right answer? Of course not. In fact, they often don't, because they haven't paused to process the question. So when kids are having pessimistic thoughts, I want them to see accurately that thought as simply first in line. And being first in line is in no way predictive of how accurate that thought is. And when you can see that as one of many possible thoughts, then you are able to be an observer of those thoughts. The one common thread across all the anxiety disorders is a complicated term, but a very easy concept. And that term is called overvalued ideation. And all it means is that we think our thoughts are more important than they are. We want people to be able to say, right now in this moment, I'm having a scary thought about whatever it is. That small preface helps them to see the behind the scenes footage of their own scary movie they're watching in their head, to understand that in that moment they're only having thoughts and they can choose how to respond to those. They can choose not to buy what those thoughts are selling when they knock on the front door, that they can observe those and not confuse thoughts with evidence, feelings with facts. And when you challenge those pessimistic, anxiety-ridden thoughts, then you can look at more optimistic outcomes. And that is really important. The next one I think is also really important. That last one there is that I'm a firm believer, and I think in our profession, we get the front row seat to this, is that suffering and struggle are pregnant with meaning and purpose. And so we've had a lot of struggle. We've certainly had an overabundance of suffering. And if we look back to Viktor Frankl back, in World War II when he survived the concentration camps, and what he wrote about in Man's Search for Meaning is the idea that human suffering is intertwined inexorably with our existence. So if our goal is to avoid it, we are destined to fail. So if we can't avoid it, what can we do? Well, we can find meaning within it, and that makes all the difference. It changes the narrative in our experience. And so I'm encouraging adults with kids, whether they're parents, teachers, professionals, whoever is working with kids, is to really have a discussion to reorient towards growth. So I believe that one of the most important questions we can ever ask ourselves is, what is life trying to teach me right now? And so asking kids those questions, being able to say, what have you learned about yourself during the last 18 months that you wouldn't have otherwise learned? You're enabling them to think more deeply in a more meaningful way about their experience, about how they've developed grit and how they've learned flexibility. And we know that flexibility is anxiety's kryptonite. We're talking about that in a minute or two. It's really important that we can have that discussion to orient kids to asking those questions about how they have learned about themselves, their skills, their abilities during this very, very challenging time. Okay, next one, please, Debbie. So I mentioned those kids who are having a negative self-view of themselves and how they lack context. So this is the metaphor I came up with to help those kids. And those are the kids who are at Study Pro, including one of my own kids who Debbie got through last year with asynchronous learning, which is that this idiot on the left, for some reason, drove his Ferrari on a beach. I think he should be banned from ever owning Ferraris. But that Ferrari lost none of its horsepower, none of its suspension, none of its handling. It's the same car as the one on the right. It's just being asked to do something it was never designed to do. And you take that Ferrari off the beach, you put it on the track, and it's going to go, go, go. And that's the context that I want these IEP and 504 and the vulnerable kids who've gotten further behind to understand. It's not you. It's that we are being asked to do something you were never designed to do. It's context dependent. And I think it's really important to have kids understand that, to give that protected view of why life has been so challenging academically for them compared to many of their peers during what's been, of course, the most challenging academic environment of our lifetimes. Okay, next one. One of the core features that we want to talk about is another complicated term, and it's called self-efficacy. And what that means basically, in a nutshell, is how do we develop confidence in our own ability to overcome challenges? And so this is what I think has been a really important lesson. And the research shows that self-efficacy is highly predictive of resilience, of outcome for treatment for anxiety and other mental disorders. So this is a central thing that we want to cultivate actively among these kids. So there's this bird on a branch. And let's say the bird looks over and it sees there's a big crack in the branch close to the trunk of the tree. Is that bird unafraid because it can think of all the reasons why that branch is strong and unlikely to break? Or is the bird unafraid because it knows it can fly? Knowing you can fly is self-efficacy. Knowing you're going to be okay, not because the bad thing is unlikely to happen, because our brain is so powerful, we can come up with a yes, but to every one of our self-reassurances that we might give. But to know that we're going to be okay, not because the bad thing or the hard thing isn't going to happen, but we're going to be okay because we can handle bad and hard things. That concept is so central to getting kids through this experience. And my hope is that the kids are going to learn grit resilient, self-efficacy through this time. We know that in 2019, the average teen was between 5 and 8 times more likely to show anxiety symptoms compared to the same age kids during World War II and the Great Depression. 38% of girls and 26% of guys before their 18th birthday will have an anxiety disorder. We are already in the age of anxiety. That's the water these kids were swimming in. 1 in 5 contemplate suicide during high school, before the pandemic hit. And then this hurricane hits and stirs the water up these kids are swimming in. My hope is that kids are going to learn to be resilient because they're watching themselves be flexible. Okay, next slide. I'm going to go through some core skills. Number one being flexibility. So oak trees make great furniture, but they know of 2 ways to be, vertical and horizontal. If the wind is strong enough, they can't stand. Flexibility is strength. I want kids to deal with anxiety the same way a palm tree deals with the wind. Palm tree doesn't fight against the wind because it has no need to. It outlasts it. Its flexibility lets them see that there are more than one way to stand. We know that Darwin knew this when he said that evolution doesn't favor the strongest or even the most intelligent. It favors the most adaptable. So we know that adaptability is nature's highest virtue. And so we know that being flexible, realizing there's more than one answer that's correct to most of life's most important questions, that there is not a narrow path to success, as Bill Stuxford talks about. I'm sure he'll mention that when he's here with Ned down the road, that flexibility is strength. Now, what can parents do about this besides cultivating resilience? Well, we're going to go through just some, I know we're running out of time, but some quick counterintuitive skills. Okay, the next one. So that I'm going to switch over to anxiety disorders for a minute, where the fear is real, but the danger is not. And Debbie's right that avoidance is the lifeblood of an anxiety disorder. That our goal is we don't treat anxiety. Anxiety is temporary and harmless. What we all treat is avoidance, and it can ruin lives. And so the more compassionate the parent is, the more vulnerable they are for getting this wrong. So here's what the science tells us. I want you to think of your child and their anxiety as separate entities. And I want you to think of their anxiety disorder as a dog begging for food. Only it's not begging for food, but it's begging for 2 other things. It's begging for attention, and it's begging for escape avoidance. Right? That's what anxiety wants. Now, when one of my Goldens is begging for food at the table and ruining my dinner, it might be very tempting to say, okay, here's a big piece of my steak, now go away and never beg again. But we all know, those of us who have dogs, that dog will go away very, very briefly. And it will not only come back and beg some more, but now it'll beg longer and louder because it's been reinforced for doing it. I want you as parents to think of your attention as your child's paycheck. That means you want to be exceptionally careful what you pay them for. And so the more that you orient them to anxiety, the more that you give the anxiety room, I promise you it will fill whatever space you give it. So our goal here is calm consistency and loving firmness. We do not want to be complicit with the use of avoidance as a means of emotional self-regulation. It is a slippery slope, and part of the reason why is, yes, it's reinforcing, but it also sends a very clear message to these kids, the opposite of the bird who can fly. It's that you can't handle doing this. Okay, next slide. So what can we do? Well, I mentioned modeling self-care. Modeling is so important. Dr. McCarthy was talking about anxiety is contagious. You know what's also contagious? Calmness. And so I want you to imagine that you are terrified to fly, but you won a trip to Hawaii, and so you suck it up and you get on the plane. It's post-pandemic. You're halfway over the ocean. You're hitting a really rough turbulence patch, and the plane's bouncing around. You're going to look around you in the cabin, and you're going to look at the flight crew, I promise you. And I want you to imagine one scenario the flight attendant says, everybody, please remain calm. We're going to get through this. The wings are very firmly attached. We're going to be landing. Just buckle up. There's no reason to cry. We'll land in an hour. Please just stay calm. And I want you to imagine the next scenario, but this time the flight attendant says, ma'am, would you like tea or coffee with your lunch? One is offering reassurance, which paradoxically validates the need to ask for it and strengthens that anxiety over time. The other one is modeling non-anxious arousal. It is much more powerful, much more effective, and is frankly counterintuitive for compassionate parents. So we want to have a bank teller or a flight attendant tone of voice. When kids are anxious, we want to avoid giving reassurance because that makes the kids want to seek our proximity. rather than to look internally for appropriate coping skills. Okay, next slide. So if a kid is struggling with a math problem, no good teacher is going to say, well, the answer is 12. Why wouldn't you? Because he'd get the answer right. Well, you wouldn't, of course, because he wouldn't learn how to solve the problem. So the same way we teach math is the same way we teach coping, is that we ask questions. So when a kid is exhibiting anxious behavior, rather than giving them the answer, we say, what can you tell yourself when you feel this way? Or what can you do when you feel this way? And if I could teach kids one thing, if I had one sentence to teach kids, it would be this: you can be scared and brave at the same time. I asked a girl before the pandemic, she missed 2 years of school, and wonderful kid, and I asked her to finish the sentence: I can be anxious and blank at the same time. What's your blank? She thought about it for a minute, got a steely look in her eyes, looked at me, and she said, I can be anxious and strong at the same time. I asked a younger kid, and he said, I can be anxious and brave at the same time. And I asked an older kid who'd been through treatment for a long time, and he said, I can be anxious and any damn thing I want to be at the same time. It's being anxious and is life, and is everything. And so that's a core skill. And so giving the kids the ability to persevere and persist in the presence of distress, to not use avoidance as a means of self-regulation, is what we want. Okay, I think one more slide and then I'll pass it over. So the mnemonic that I use, I know Debbie's heard me say this a million times, is that with our attention, our instincts are to reassure, to soothe, but that reinforces the behavior that we're trying to eliminate and makes it more likely to happen again. So the most powerful tool any parent can do is to catch the kids coping well, to give attention, high fives, fist bumps, hugs, discussions, all kinds of wonderful parenting that everyone on this call excels at. But I want you to apply that to the seeds that you want to see grow. When you see these prickly weeds that are getting in the way, we don't want to water those seeds with our attention. And if we can be consistent and water the seeds and not the weeds, over time, the weeds will wither and the seeds will grow. There's a fancy term for that as differential reinforcement, but it is 80% of evidence-based treatment the parents can use is lowering accommodation of anxiety, validating the emotions, naming and containing the emotions. This is, hey, it seems like you're feeling blank. So you're naming it. And then you are saying, what can you do when you feel this way? What can you tell yourself when you feel this way? We know this works. We know we can build resilience. We know we've never had a greater need to really disperse these skills to these kids that are at such a high risk for mental disorders right now, given the situation that we're all finding ourselves in. So thank you for indulging me for a few minutes talking about these things. And of course, Debbie, thank you so much for everything that you do at StudyPro.
Oh, thank you so much. I am going to move over to Dr. Zimmitti's slides. And as usual, I was feverishly scribbling things down. As a reminder, everyone, Dr. Zimmitti will speak, and then we're going to open it up to questions. And as I hope everyone knows, this is scheduled till 10:15. So Dr. Zimmitti, I'm going to just leave all my accolades to the slide and how amazing you are. And because I know we're running a little bit lower on time, but we're so grateful for everything you've done, obviously at Georgetown Psychology, but also as Dr. McCarthy already said, launching Helix, which is right here in our neighborhood. So we'll just turn this over to you.
Thank you. Well, it's funny because I thought, okay, they've said so many things already. I can just kind of rush through some of this. And then I thought, no, we always want to rush through the parenting part. Like, we never want to give ourselves the time and attention that we need. So I'm not going to do it. But in saying that, I am going to skip over some of the things that I think are less important. As I've been listening to the other presenters, of course, it really helps to just really get to the what can we do, instead of, I think they've done such a nice job of talking about the state of things. And I'll add that we really are in this collective trauma, and even within that, there's a lot of individual trauma. And on top of the pandemic, we have so many other things going on that are affecting parents and kids, the racial injustice, all this political polarization. People's families have been sort of decimated by all the differences in how they're feeling about things, and even down to vaccines. So I think we're just in a really vulnerable time. So I'm going to have you just go to the next slide. So just very quickly, I was going to talk a little bit more about this, but I think that's already been nicely done. So I thought what I might do, I think the one thing that I still see, and my background is really in diagnostic testing, and what I still see to this day and saw from the very beginning, there is a subset of kids and families that are thriving. While we're all going through so many things, they will secretly say to me, I feel embarrassed to say it, but while you're assessing my child, you really should know this was really the best reset for our family. We work from home now, we have flexibility. The kids happen to go to schools that did a beautiful job with distance learning and also got the kids back in school very quickly. So, there is that subset, but there's clearly a subset, which, I'll quickly go through too, which is this whole concept of burnout. And we've researched burnout for years in the helping professions, employees, in the workplace, but now we're really studying burnout in parents. And what I'd love to do just for a moment is if people in the chat, on a scale of 0 to 10, where do you see yourself right now in terms of the parenting perspective, and even kind of personally how you're feeling? I'd love to just see some numbers in the chat. 2, 8, 3, yeah, okay, lots of 8s are coming up. So I think okay, we have lots of people falling, of course, it's that thing, toward the lower numbers, but we do have a lot in the higher. Thank you so much for being so honest. I love it. So let's go to the next slide. So I think I will comment on this just because so many people are in that higher range. And I think before we can really think about self-care, we have to really know where we are. We have to really be able to recognize parental burnout. Are we there? Are we on our way to parental burnout? What is it? It's essentially an imbalance of stress and resources. So, do you feel like the CEO of a company that's falling apart? Do you just wish somebody else could come in and take over for you? You're run down, exhausted, chronically stressed. And these are just some of the symptoms of it: feeling exhausted, putting distance between ourselves and our kids, using more negative parenting practices, doing the things that we don't want to do and we feel bad about it after. And that's really the hallmark of burnout for parents, is you're acting and doing things that you end up feeling really guilty about. And then kind of where do you go from there? So it just starts this whole cycle. Next slide. Okay, so as we've been hearing, the world really is opening up, but we are still suffering. We haven't recovered from the stress, and we're going to be in this for a long time. Things are constantly changing. Just when I got used to masking up again indoors after loving being unmasked indoors, Montgomery, Maryland is now changing it again, where on Thursday it looks like we might not have to wear them inside again. So what is, where there's just so much uncertainty, and it drives so much of our distress. So why is it important? I think we really honestly need to take a look at where we are in terms of our stress, and how can we really give our kids what they need if our bucket is empty? I love the filling the bucket metaphor. I know, Debbie, you love sort of the bank account withdrawals, deposits metaphor, and I think there's so many different metaphors out there. But I think we really have to, I love the idea that the bucket is really a symbol of our physical health, our emotional health. It's where we put our joy. It's where we put our relaxation and safety. And so as it flows out, it has to be flowing in. And the only one who can make it flow in is really ourselves. So on a scale, I love just trying to be somewhat interactive, even though there's a lot of people on here and I don't even see your faces. But where are you in terms of filling your bucket? If 0 is your bucket is pretty bone dry, and 5 is overflowing and you have so much to give, I'd love to just see in the chat, where are people feeling in terms of their own bucket? Okay, so, okay, there's such a nice variety. There's a lot of 2s and 3s, and I think a lot of us hear you and feel the same. So why don't we go to the next slide? Okay, so what can we do to be the best parents we can be? So I'm stealing something from a colleague, Dr. Jody Blyberg, and she uses this in the work that she does with parents and partners, couples in our office. And she's always talking about parent as the noun. You know, we are so busy actively parenting. Parent is a verb too, obviously, but we really need to take it back and think about it as a noun. We're people. We're not just doers who are constantly filling up our kids' buckets and our partners' buckets and, you know, everyone around us, our parents, our coworkers, all of that. But we really spend so much time taking care of everyone else, and we really need to be focusing on ourselves. We have to have enough to give. So, you know, let's think about, like, what are some of the things that fills our bucket? It's going to be different for everyone. I do want to touch on, and this is where I think people kind of, you know, check out and start thinking about what they're going to have for lunch. And like they start, you know, it's like, okay, if somebody tells me one more time to get sleep and nutrition and exercise and be mindful, I'm going to, you know, and I think that's the challenge with self-care, is we kind of all know what to do. I'm sure you've heard this so many times, but we just have such a hard time activating ourselves to actually do it. And I think it's just such a representation of how we give to everyone else. Even when I was doing this presentation and writing it, I thought, oh my goodness, after like 7 a.m., I'm not really doing a lot of my own bucket filling. I do it all before my family wakes up. So I better do a lot because I've got a long day to get through. And so when you really start to look at your own life and how it has to be a very conscious process. So I hope that in this, if there's just one thing you can take away from this, talk about self-care and be more conscious of how you fill yourself up. But I do want to say that the basics here they're not just the basics, they truly are the essentials. And I'm gonna change that the next time I give this talk. But you know, if you're a parent that thinks you can function on 5 to 6 hours of sleep and you're fine, the research says you're not. You know, I think there's a lot of people that think they're fine at 5 to 6 hours, but for most people, that's really not true. We're looking at like 7 to 8 hours to be our best selves. Eating well, exercising. I'm going to talk a bit at the end about mindfulness and meditation because, you know, I honestly think if I could give everybody one thing to take home today, it would be to find that and how to put that piece in your bucket, because it is life-changing and it will absolutely change your parenting. So let's go. Okay, before we do that, I'd love to just maybe have people in the chat write a few things down that fill their buckets. It can be simple. You know, things that bring you joy, that help you feel calm or energized. You know, like I said, for me, it's in the morning, getting up before everyone, meditating, drinking my coffee before it gets cold. I love having egg sandwiches with my family on Sundays or reading with my daughter at night. These are different things that fill my bucket. Oh, playing with puppies. I love that. Yes. Okay, oh, this is so great. So take a look at the chat. There's like a lot of great things in there. So okay, so why does all this even matter? You know, why does it matter if we fill our buckets? Because it's just like Dr. Dalton and Dr. McCarthy were saying, that how you feel has such a ripple effect on your family, especially your kids. And it's not only what you do and what you say, but it is truly how you feel. And we all know that, parenting is really like 30% what you say, and it's mostly what you do. And so I think if we can just really focus on those two things, I'm not going to go too much into these others. I might touch on it in a second, but I really, this is where I feel really strongly about meditation and mindfulness. And I think this is where I'll put the plug in for it, because we already heard that it's a way to sort of give some distance to a situation and be an observer. It is, if you can find a way, and I'm happy to talk to people. I will tell you, one of the people, Bill Stixrud, who's talked about meditation and transcendental meditation for many, many, many years. And I had to hear it many, many times. And then I had to turn 50 to finally say, what's the one thing I haven't done in my life before 50 that I want to do? And I said, that's it. I'm going to learn this thing. And so I think what it really does, not just in terms of kind of our own stress and being able to manage things better, is it really allows you to have that pause in all of your relationships, but especially with your kids, and have more ability to listen and validate and not jump in and react. And parents, when we can not react, our kids are very different. They act differently. Things are calmer. The emotional thermometer is down. And, so I really encourage people to not just hear it again and say, oh yeah, nobody has time for that. I mean, I was one of those people. When somebody told me how much time it takes, I'm like, okay, yeah. And who's going to get up and get my kids breakfast and, do all these things? And you know what? If we don't invest in ourselves, nobody else is going to do it. So we have to find the time and find ways to even ask people to help us to find that time. So I think I'll just mention, and I thought Dr. Dalton would actually mention this particular treatment, because we do have evidence now that shows that parents are such a powerful effect on their kids. So this space treatment, designed by Ellie Leibovitz, which I know Dr. Dalton does in his practice. I was just trained in it, and I'm in such awe. And what I love about it is the kids don't even need to be in treatment. The idea is that we can work with parents and help shift and shape their behavior so that the kids' symptoms improve, that they're better able to cope. And so we have research now that shows that this works. And so it works in lots of different ways. And now with the, it is so hard to get therapy appointments for kids right now. Everybody's full. There is a dearth of therapists considering the crisis that we're in. And so working with parents is a really powerful way to help kids in general. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so here's the slide. So I'll just kind of go through these things. I'm taking longer than I had hoped to, but this is sort of the what can we do? And this is where I would say, if you could just take one thing and take it and give it a try. I mean, the first thing I would say is really being able to really visualize, a time in your life where you felt like you. What was that? Maybe you were younger. It wasn't an accomplishment. It was more of an experience. Was it dancing? Was it music? Was it athletics? Like, what was that for you? And really being able to think and then figure out, how do I adapt that to my life now? So if you loved dancing and music, you may not run out and, join a dance class or, something like that, but you could, turn off the news in the car, or turn it off in the morning and put on music, or have your kids do a playlist for you and play that while you're driving to school in the mornings. Like, find ways to bring those things into your daily life and into your bucket. I'm not going to go over all of those. I think some of the things I really just want to also say is really the importance of relationships. Looking this whole piece of optimism and resilience is so essential. Being able to find ways to lower your stress. I just did this today. I said, okay, I'm feeling a bit stressed. What can I cancel this week? I canceled one thing, a meeting tomorrow that I've rescheduled now till mid-November, and I feel better. Go into your calendar and take something out of it or reschedule it and give yourself a break and give yourself something to do for yourself in place of that. Here's one that I love. It is, I don't know if somebody told me this or I read it in a book, but it was kind of life-changing, where to be successful in life, you have to be bad at two things. So take the two things you're always trying to be really good at and you never quite get there, and just decide to not be good at them. So for me, it was gardening, taking care of plants. I'm terrible at it. I always also wanted to make these beautiful Italian dinners for my family. It's just not happening. And so now I've just decided and have, alerted everybody, these are the two things I don't do, and I'm not going to be doing them. And how can we sort of find someone else who can plant and take care of things and all of that. So, really kind of letting go of those things that really are really related to perfectionism. We just want to be good enough parents. I think another thing is finding those things in the lockdown that made lockdown good for you. Was it sitting with a puzzle and your kids would sort of come through and talk to you while you were sitting there? Well, now we're back in real life, so we stopped doing a lot of those things. We stopped riding bikes after dinner. Can you bring one of those things back in? The other thing I would mention that's not on here is self-care. How do we model that? I think, Jonathan, you mentioned that. And it is so essential, and it is something you can do with your kids from the time they're very young. I do self-care Sundays in my house. We all find ways to do self-care. In fact, I have to show you this, and I got her permission, but it just shows you. Oh, I can't show it. I don't know how to do it on this thing. Oh, darn. Oh, wait. She has this, my daughter has a self-care sticker on her. I thought, well, maybe I've done one thing right as a mom. I really believe in self-care, and I love it on Sundays with kids, because then instead of Monday feeling so hard, we model taking care of ourselves to kind of have the energy and our bucket being full enough to move into the week to come. So, I think right now, if I had to give one suggestion, it would be to really prioritize mental health. Our kids are suffering, we're suffering. Let your kids know that your most important priority is their mental health. Don't be afraid to talk about it. And that I'll sort of end there. So.
Thank you so much. You guys are incredible. So there was a request to answer a few questions. I don't know if Dr. McCarthy, Dalton, or Dr. Zimmitti, you have a couple of extra minutes. But if anyone has to go, please, you do. But there was a ton of questions about technology. So thank you, Dr. Zimmitti, for that. I don't want to rush through my thank you. But one of them from Cecilia was, to what extent does screen-based technology cause or exacerbate the mental health challenges? And there was a lot of questions about, the other part of her question does the research distinguish between routine disruption caused by the pandemic and the effects of overexposure of technology? And then there was questions specifically about, do we give my student or my child Snapchat or other access to these or not? So I don't know who wants to take it first. Dr. McCarthy, you want to comment?
I mean, I don't, it hasn't been broken down perfectly at all, which is frustrating. And it was just really, that's the one advantage of the webinars. I can just say these things and be like, see ya, screen time's really bad, and what did we do? Absolutely necessary. It's the same thing as pre-pandemic, the same time, 18 months. I mean, I regret that in my first lecture and talking about how to manage the pandemic, I said something like, thank God for screen time. Who would have guessed I would have said that? Because I'm always, got to pull back, got to get outside, get people's brains not always looking at screens. And then I said that, and I think I sort of this launched this. We just got to do what we can do, get through it, and, it's just the way it is to get by. to have people still connected, in some way. But not always common sense prevails, but common sense will prevail with this. As anything expose yourself to over and over, that's what your brain gets used to. And it's varying. It hasn't been distilled whether, we know high intensity gaming, what that does to dopamine for the brain in vulnerable populations, but certainly passive screen time in this study showing concern. Bottom line, as much as we can, goodness gracious, come Thanksgiving, my kids come home from college. Do you think when they're like, look at the phones, and I say like, get outside, that anyone's going to listen to me? Or like, I got a family Peloton membership. No, no, I can't. It's not gonna happen. It always involves paying them off, which doesn't even work anymore. I said, stop looking at your screen. You guys, well, I'll pay you to not see. It's like it's not have a job. But so try, recognizing there's an impact. We don't know how much. It's again, do we wait for the data to come? Like, oh, okay, we were okay with having this much. Having interaction, not passive, zombie stuff, common sense, not good for the brain. But they haven't distilled it down. With regard to Snapchat and all that piece, before the pandemic, there's, without question, deterioration in mental health of girls, highly correlated with the invention of smartphones and, social media. And anytime you compare yourself to, somebody else doing something else without you, we all feel bad. Even when we look at anybody else, we always compare. It's our primate heritage. We immediately self-reference, just like any other orangutan, chimpanzee. We immediately look at what someone else is doing, even if we say we don't judge. I always say, I don't judge, but it's impossible as a primate that we always compare, even if non-verbally. So, all of us know, the holiday cards where you see it and it's like your best friend, and it's like at the same time their kids won a Nobel Prize, and it just really, just everything is so great, and at this year, and oh my gosh, I still haven't cleaned my closet, and we always compare, and so that culture affecting girls, increased suicidality, still the same. Is it more than before? Yes, being in your head in the pandemic all the time, in your head thinking about these things is hard. So we won't be able to wait for the data to be able to distill passive screen time, active screen time, to be able to see what has the impact. Because now it's gone so long, and thank goodness, in schools, thank goodness, not thank God for video games, thank goodness they're in school, because that's what brains need. Bottom line, so much of what gets born out when it comes to research is what evolutionarily, just like adaptability, that's one of my favorite words that Dr. Dalton used, is what, has made us, rocket on this planet as humans. And it's being active, it's being outside, it's being with other humans, it's having purpose, it's working towards goals, not looking at this. So looking at what is good that way. But it's frustrating. Someone can answer that, I'm sure, better than I can, but we don't know yet. And in the end, I don't think we can wait to know. Because looking at a certain country that has blocked the video game stuff in the news, there's other people know stuff. I think just concerning that there's stuff out there when it could be developing brains. We can't wait to know. But yet it's hard, because at Thanksgiving, I'm sure the McCarthys will like that. I'll take a picture. Maybe I'll put it on Insta.
I would add to that. I really now have listened to Frances Haugen, the whistleblower at Facebook, who very frankly said, I have one of my kids who's coming up on 13 and is like, okay, I'm 13 now. I get to get on Instagram, right? I'm like, well, actually, we're going to talk about that, because she said that she doesn't think kids should really be on this until they're 16. And so I really listened to that, and I thought, well, this is, not knowing where I'll come down on all this yet, to really be thoughtful of when our kids may be ready and when they're not ready. And that one of the other things we know is that kids do better when they're more active on social media, and they're active with friends, and they're commenting on things rather than sitting passively kind of lurking in the background. And then the other place I would just point people, if you go and look at the information on Dr. Clifford Sussman's website, he's local in Chevy Chase. He has wonderful videos also for kids that are free on his website. And he talks about, and it's the simplest way to break it down for kids and teenagers, is low dopamine versus high dopamine activities, and essentially following a high dopamine. So like sitting on social media or gaming, following it with the same amount of time with low dopamine. So reading, going out for a walk, doing some exercise, things like that. So I would just point you there because he has great information on how to manage some of this, and it's very practical.
That's really helpful. Thank you for that. And we'll look for a link for that and send that link out with the resources and the replay. Dr. Dalton, there was a question about my son is struggling and he chooses to block it out. Is this avoidance? Should I encourage him to talk, or am I then giving the begging dog attention?
Well, yeah, I saw that. That's a great question. And it's hard for me to give a specific answer without knowing the child involved with it. But, I treat school avoidance and avoidance of all kinds. And the illusion is the kids are avoiding school or they're avoiding whatever they're physically not doing. The reality is they're avoiding the emotions they feel when they're doing those things. And the term for that is experiential avoidance, or EA. And the more research coming out, the more we see that experiential avoidance is really at the root of so much of our emotional suffering. And so we want to have a different relationship with our emotions, one that's based on the fact that I'm strong enough to sit with what I'm feeling. That I'll have the older kids sometimes write a little short story, like a paragraph, about a misshapen cloud. Cloud wakes up and it comes into existence and it's a different shape than the other clouds and it thinks it's misshapen. And of course the kids realize that that's it's folly, because there's no right way for a cloud to be shaped. So there's no wrong way for a cloud to be shaped. I'll say, great, now I want you to write that same short story, but this time about a misshapen feeling. And they'll understand pretty quickly the same is true. There is no way you're supposed to feel. And so being able to have a different relationship, to have an informed perspective, that we can allow ourselves to be a curious observer of our own experience, and we are strong enough to sit with them. So that's a long-winded way of saying, yeah, what your son is doing is probably avoidance. Even if it's not physical avoidance, it's avoidance of emotion. And we know instinctively, our intuition tells us that if we're avoiding ourselves, that can't be healthy. That we want to have a more welcoming stance, that the present moment is not lacking, regardless of what it consists of. That happiness is not something that we pursue. That's something, if you look up the dictionary definition of pursue, is to chase with hostility. And the implication of that is it exists somewhere else other than where we currently are. And so being able to say that I can accept right now where I am in an unadulterated, non-judgmental fashion, I can sit with these feelings. That's what we want to do. That's the opposite of avoidance. And remember, it's not the situations they're avoiding, it's the emotions they feel in those situations.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Okay, the last couple of questions, I'm going to kind of combine some things. So there was a question about, given what you say about the ripple effect of our attitude on kids, and I loved all of that, which is so helpful, and teach kids when, can we talk about how to model and teach kids when parents' buckets go really negative, like a diagnosis of a serious illness, a layoff, or other big negative news in life you can't control or protect them from? So how can we model and teach kids when parents goes negative?
Well, I guess what I would say in an age-appropriate way is to be able to talk to kids about that. I think sometimes we think we're protecting our kids, and certainly there's a balance of how to know how much kids can handle. But I think kids understanding kind of where we are and being able to talk with them about how we're feeling, it kind of sets the tone. And, sometimes kids will even step up to try to help fill your bucket for you, when you have things coming up or you're feeling drained, or there's something you feel like you can't do. It really gives kids an opportunity to give to you. And that feels really good for them. Part of that is really, it's not just filling your own bucket, but having enough to give to somebody else, which then in turn makes you feel better. So I think I think it all comes down to talking to kids about where we are in an honest way when we're not feeling frazzled about it and exhausted, and having those conversations when we feel like we can have it in a way that feels meaningful and calm.
And I would just add to that that Kristen Neff is a psychologist who specializes in self-compassion, and she has an absolutely wonderful website that she's recently updated. It's self-compassion.org, and there are resources to build self-compassion. There are audio files to listen to. It's a really wonderful website, a lot of great resources on there. But one of the major tenets of that is that we as humans tend to view our suffering as isolative. It's what separates us from somebody else. And we know that's not true. Rather than being a force that separates us, it's actually the connective tissue that ties us together. And so, so I think as parents, it's our responsibility to take good care of ourselves. And I'm speaking to myself and all of us. This is not an easy time to be a parent, and being able to recognize that I'm struggling in my role right now. And so how do I live more consistently in line with my values, and not seeking out my own comfort, which means that, okay, you have to take care of yourself emotionally, physically, because your kids need you to be present in a healthy way. And so it's not just a luxury, as we heard speakers say, it's absolutely essential that we do that. And that website's a great place to start.
And we will definitely send that information when we send the replay, because that was a quick question. So the last question, and I just want to make a quick comment on one of the other questions. So we are, and I think Dr. Zimmitti knows this, we are trying to get somebody to speak on the space therapy, right, from the Helix Center, we hope, at some point in one of these webinars.
Amy,
So so watch out for that one. And then there was a question about where you can learn about smart therapy, but maybe I'll hit you up on that one, Dr. Zimmitti, and then we'll send that out with the replay. Yeah. And then there was the last question, which sounds a little self-serving here for me to end, but this was it. Do you have any specific thoughts on how to support high school teens and ADHD with ADHD and delayed executive function? They jumped from mid-8th grade and now have to manage high school as 10th grader with the steps in between. They're really struggling to cope and manage life. So there's kind of the life piece, obviously, and I'm sure there's the school piece, but thoughts on that from our panel as our question.
Kathy.
I couldn't hear it. Can you say the end of it real quick? I just couldn't.
Yeah,
you have it. I was looking for it in the print.
It was a question about how to use support high school teens with ADHD and delayed EF, but a lot of kids jumped basically.
Yeah, I didn't know, delete. Yeah. Oh my gosh. I mean, that's why I was pausing. Now, as in the now, yes, like not your field, Debbie, of all the time.
Right study now, study pros one answer.
Yeah,
of course,
I just right now, just I can't emphasize enough that what we're asking them to do, just like my, describing what I imagine what it'd be like for them to do on top of it already having been hard before. And yes, they need to learn these skills to be able to function as adults, need to have, frontal lobe skills and be able to manage at college, or whatever they do after that, or not that. And, but right now, given, I really try to look at, not that it's given like, oh, nobody has to do anything, but at resetting what our expectations are, because to have missed out on what was already hard to help strengthen those pieces from all those other cues and then be slammed with everything else socially, volume wise, it's like it feels in many degrees academic pressure where it's like this never happened, and yes, the SAT or ACT is test optional now, and I've always been a more positive person, but I kind of thinking it's going to not go away as everyone hoped, but that's just me. Just that it's expecting everything of the frontal lobe's executive function that ever was without, it's like I just look at it as like what it would be is if we broke an arm and then didn't get PT and then all of a sudden had to be back at it in whatever sport we were doing, suddenly running a 10K. So to expect kids to all of a sudden be back at what was hard for them already is just impossible. Just like, you gotta do PT and rehab if you have something injured. Now, it's not a cop out to be like, oh, so tough for you. You don't have to do anything because real life doesn't care. Just like if you break something, you still got to keep going, and just like, if you have ADHD and impulsive, if a cop pulls you over, you can't use that as an excuse for driving fast. So more than anything, I think going back to what, each Dr. Zimmitti, Dr. Dalton talked about is real acceptance that this is so hard, that getting back on it with all of this intensity demand, and even just taking classes in school with doing a lot of them, even the college students, open notes, they haven't had the practice. And so really, it's horrible as a parent to recognize that the impact of this on performance and what that means to the future, because the future won't remember this when they're sending in their applications. I know I often refer to college so much, but that's what's on everybody's minds, even if we say it's not, if we say it doesn't matter, but everyone's minds. So to know that it all still matters, and a couple of years from now won't be thought of as an excuse that you can write your essay about, even though they each deserve to write an essay, we all do. And to recognize we got to reset our expectations. That's why I like that motto of the Helix so much, is resetting, knowing that this has changed us, it has changed them. They had it harder to begin with. Helping them support it, knowing that they've got to live in the real world like we all do, but knowing that we have to completely reset how we look at it, and it's going to take some time, just like after surgery. So compassion for them, just like compassion for us, because I just cannot imagine how they're going through this. We didn't have to go through this, and yes, will make them stronger. I love that. I didn't more doom and gloom in the psychiatry, the state of things, state of the state, but really, in the end, that Viktor Frankl book is always it'd be on my desk if I didn't knock it on the floor and it didn't get spilled on, by the coffee, but that I'll clamp after. But just being compassionate with the kids. Yes, it's so hard. Yes, we'll dig out together. Yes, I will get you all the support, tutors, anything you need, because you're going to need extra, and if and serving as a, not just consultant, but more support that way, just like you'd be helping someone get over being sick. And then, yes, it's back to the real world. World's going to still have the same demands, but how can we possibly reset our expectations? That's how I look at it. That was more than you asked for, but
It was fantastic.
The awkward silence go to them. I waited. That was
fantastic ending. We appreciate it. And you guys, you've been so generous with your time. Thank you for going over a little bit, and thanks for all the people. We do, of course, try to end on time, but in this case, I know there were several requests for us to just be able to answer some questions. You guys, thank you to everybody. We really appreciate it. We're so grateful. Thanks for sharing all of this. We will send out the all of the replay and all of the resources that we've captured, and we hope that your desk gets clean, Dr. McCarthy and Dr. Dalton. We hope you have a break from those 50 presentations, at least a moment to breathe. And Dr. Zimmitti, we are meditating for you, with you, and we're so grateful. I mentioned to you, we also, as we're wrapping up, I also listened to Dr. Stixrud and took my daughter to do the transcendental meditation. It is life-changing. So I hope you all have a chance to do that. Thank you. Grateful for everyone who attended, and have a wonderful day. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.